You've heard the stereotype before, maybe from a sitcom joke, a comment section, an uncle at a dinner table. The feminist who secretly hates men, angry, resentful, looking for a reason to be offended. It's repeated so often it barely registers as a claim anymore. It just sits there in the background of how a lot of people picture the word feminist in the first place. But here's the strange part. When psychologists actually built tools to measure this exact thing, hostility toward men, and tested it against real survey data, the picture that came back looked almost nothing like the stereotype. Most people assume that identifying as a feminist should predict more negative feelings toward men as a group, since that's supposedly the whole point. That's not quite right, and the real answer is far stranger than that. Attitude researchers have spent decades measuring hostility toward men directly, using real, validated psychological instruments, not vibes or anecdotes, and what they've consistently found is a gap between a stigmatized label and the actual beliefs and attitudes underneath it, a gap far bigger than most people assume. In 1996, psychologists Peter Glick and Susan Fiske introduced what they called Ambivalent Sexism Theory, published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. Their key insight was that attitudes about gender aren't a simple single dial running from not sexist to sexist. They're two separate dimensions, hostile and benevolent, that can coexist in the same person at the same time. 3 years later, in 1999, they built a companion measure specifically for the other direction, called the Ambivalence Toward Men Inventory, designed to measure women's hostile and benevolent attitudes toward men using the same two-part framework. For the first time, researchers had an actual instrument to test the man-hating feminist claim directly, instead of just assuming it. Here's where it gets stranger. Large-scale public opinion research on this topic keeps surfacing a completely different problem than the one the stereotype describes. Not a hostility problem, but a labeling problem. Survey after survey has found that when you ask people directly about specific feminist positions, equal pay for equal work, equal opportunity in hiring, ending violence against women, large majorities agree, often crossing political and gender lines. But when you ask that same group of people whether they'd call themselves a feminist, the number willing to accept the label drops sharply. The beliefs are common. The word attached to them carries a stigma the beliefs themselves don't seem to deserve, which means a huge number of people who functionally hold feminist positions actively distance themselves from the word, specifically because of a caricature they don't want to be associated with. But that's only half the story, and honestly, what comes next is even stranger. Psychologists studying stereotypes have a specific term for what happens next, a meta-stereotype, which is a person's belief about how their own group is stereotyped by outsiders. Women who hold feminist beliefs are frequently aware, explicitly, that the outside caricature of feminist includes man-hating, humorlessness, and anger. Research on stigmatized identities shows that awareness of a negative meta-stereotype changes behavior on its own, independent of whether the stereotype is true. People soften their language, add disclaimers, or avoid the label entirely. The now familiar, "I'm not a feminist, but I think women should be paid equally" pattern. Not because their actual views shifted, but because the label itself has become expensive to wear in public. And here's the part that should genuinely reframe how you think about this. The stereotype didn't emerge from the data. The data came later, and largely didn't support it. The stereotype spread first, through decades of media shorthand, sitcom punchlines, and secondhand characterizations, long before anyone systematically measured whether self-identified feminists actually scored higher on hostility toward men than anyone else. A caricature became common knowledge before it became a testable claim, and once it was finally tested using real instruments built specifically to catch exactly this kind of hostility, the claim didn't hold up the way its decades of repetition implied it would. Which raises an uncomfortable question. If an entire personality type, resentful, man-hating, endlessly repeated in jokes and headlines, can circulate as common knowledge for decades before anyone actually measures whether it's true, how many other groups do you already have a fully formed opinion about, not from a real conversation, not from evidence, but from a joke you heard secondhand so many times it started to feel like something you'd personally verified? So here's what the actual research shows. It isn't that feminist identification reliably predicts hostility toward men the way the stereotype assumes. It isn't that the man-hating feminist is a measured psychological profile validated by attitude research. It isn't even that most people who hold feminist beliefs are comfortable calling themselves feminists in the first place. Plenty quietly agree with the substance while avoiding the label entirely. It's that a caricature got to spend decades unchallenged in the culture before the actual measuring tools existed to check it, and by the time they did, the caricature had already done its job, teaching people to flinch at a word attached to beliefs most of them already shared.